By the time most witnesses understood what they were watching, it was already over. 5 men, each respected in his own discipline, stepped into a ring expecting comparison, maybe confrontation. 12 seconds later, none of them were standing where they intended to stand. There were no visible injuries, no celebration, no raised hands, only a quiet recalibration in the room, an unspoken agreement that whatever rules they had arrived with no longer applied. What mattered was not what Bruce Lee did. It was what he made unnecessary. The room was not large, and it was not meant for spectacle. It was the kind of space used when people expected clarity rather than applause. No banners, no audience tears, just a squared ring, worn at the edges, surrounded by chairs pulled close enough that nothing could be mistaken for distance. This took place during a period when martial arts were still guarded by borders, cultural, national, and philosophical. Styles were identities. Lineages were defended. A man's credibility came from where he trained, who trained him, and how long he stayed loyal to one method. Crossing disciplines was viewed with suspicion. Blending them was often dismissed outright. Those present that day understood this without needing it explained. Each fighter arrived carrying more than skill. They carried representation. Their posture, their silence, even the way they wrapped their hands signaled allegiance to systems older than the room itself. No one announced a contest. No one needed to. The ring existed as a neutral ground, but neutrality did not mean equality. It meant exposure. Once inside, there would be nowhere to hide behind titles or tradition. Only movement, distance, timing. Things that could not be argued after the fact. Bruce Lee entered without ceremony. There was no entourage, no visible preparation ritual. He wore no markers of rank that would have helped an observer categorize him quickly. This absence was noticed immediately. In a room where lineage mattered, he brought none forward. That alone unsettled some of the witnesses. Lee did not pace. He did not stretch theatrically. He stood as if he were waiting for something ordinary, like a train that was known to arrive on time. His attention moved through the room, not resting on faces, not measuring bodies in any obvious way. Those watching later said this was the first signal that something about the encounter would resist narration. The era was one of proving. Martial artists tested themselves constantly. Through challenge matches, controlled exchanges, demonstrations meant to settle quiet debates. Victory mattered, but validation mattered more. Being seen mattered. Yet this moment did not feel like a proving ground. Felt more like an intersection. Outside the room, the world was changing. Disciplines were beginning to collide. Old certainties were weakening under new questions. Efficiency over elegance, adaptability over purity. Bruce Lee had been associated with those questions, sometimes praised for them, often criticized. Inside the room, those tensions condensed. No one spoke about rules. No one clarified intent. The fighters stepped closer to the ring not because they were told to, but because the space demanded it. The chairs creaked. Someone cleared their throat and stopped halfway through, as if deciding silence was safer. This was not anticipation in the theatrical sense. It was recognition, subtle, uneasy, that whatever happened next would not fit neatly into the categories everyone had brought with them. And once that recognition settled, there was no way to leave without staying to see it through. The 5 fighters were known quantities long before they entered the room. Not celebrities in the modern sense, but authorities, men whose names carried weight in training halls and private conversations. Each represented a system refined over decades, sometimes centuries. Their movements were disciplined by rules that had survived generations precisely because they worked. Observers later recalled how easily they could identify each man's background before anything began. One stood with a narrow, upright frame conserving motion. Another carried his weight lower, grounded, prepared to absorb force rather than evade it. A third rolled his shoulders slightly as if already accounting for impact. These were not habits picked up casually. They were the residue of long obedience to a single method. No one doubted their legitimacy. If anything, the room leaned toward respect for them. Bruce Lee complicated that balance simply by being there. His reputation did not rest on a single lineage. Some knew him as an actor who moved too fast to be theatrical. Others knew him as a teacher who asked questions that made instructors uncomfortable. A few had heard stories, short, unfinished accounts of exchanges that ended quickly and were rarely described the same way twice. What unsettled people was not that Lee challenged tradition openly. It was that he seemed uninterested in challenging it at all. He did not argue theory. He did not critique stances or techniques aloud. He never announced superiority. In a culture accustomed to formal declarations of style and intent, this refusal to define himself created a vacuum. Expectation rushed to fill it. Some assumed he would demonstrate speed. Others expected improvisation, maybe unpredictability. A few anticipated a performance designed to shock, to prove a point. These assumptions circulated silently, passed through glances rather than words. The 5 fighters acknowledged one another with brief nods. They did not acknowledge Lee in the same way. This was not disrespect. It was categorization. They were measuring him against known frameworks and finding no clean placement. Without a clear category, comparison became difficult. Without comparison, hierarchy remained unresolved. Lee noticed this but gave no sign of responding to it. Witnesses later described his demeanor as restrained, almost deliberately unremarkable. His breathing was steady, his posture neutral. Nothing in his stance announced readiness in the conventional sense. It looked to some like waiting, yet there was an underlying precision to that stillness. Not relaxation, not tension, something held in reserve. The expectation in the room began to tilt. What had felt like a gathering of authorities now felt like a question without a clear answer. If this were a test, it was unclear who was being tested. And if this were a challenge, it was unclear who had issued it. That uncertainty lingered, quietly pressing on everyone present, as the distance between reputations and reality began to narrow. The tension did not arrive all at once. It accumulated in small, almost forgettable ways. A shift of weight that went unanswered. An adjustment of distance that did not produce a counter. Moments where instinct suggested action, and discipline restrained it. No one had signaled the beginning, yet everyone behaved as if it had already started. The 5 fighters occupied the ring with practiced awareness. Their spacing was deliberate, not collaborative, but respectful of one another's presence. Each man understood angles, understood how quickly chaos could replace order if proximity collapsed too soon. They were not reckless. They were patient. Bruce Lee stood among them without asserting position. This, more than anything, unsettled the observers. In most public challenges, even restrained ones, there is an implicit negotiation of dominance before the first exchange. A claiming of center, a tightening of posture, a visible readiness meant to discourage intrusion. Lee offered none of this. He did not claim the center, nor did he avoid it. He did not mirror anyone's stance. He did not retreat to the perimeter. His placement seemed almost incidental, as if he were there because the space happened to be where he was standing. Witnesses later struggled to describe how he held attention without demanding it. Some said it was because he watched everything. Others said it was because he watched nothing in particular. What they agreed on was that his focus did not narrow. It remained wide, inclusive, patient. The fighters noticed this. One of them tested distance, not with an attack, but with a subtle advance, the kind meant to provoke a reaction. Lee adjusted his position by a fraction, no more than was required. The movement did not resemble evasion. It resembled correction. The advance did not repeat. Another fighter shifted his stance, angling his lead side, preparing for engagement. Lee did not mirror him. He did not oppose the angle. He simply stood where the angle no longer mattered. This absence of visible response began to exert pressure. Martial training conditions the body to read cues. Tension in the shoulders, tightening of the jaw, narrowing of the eyes. These signals precede commitment. They allow prediction. Lee offered none of them. The silence in the room deepened, not because nothing was happening, but because too many things were happening at once. Micro-adjustments, recalculations, instincts being checked and rechecked. No one wanted to be first. Not out of fear, but out of uncertainty. An uncommitted action would reveal more about the initiator than the target. And something about Lee suggested that any unnecessary motion would be accounted for, perhaps even used. The tension became self-sustaining. What the observers felt was not anticipation of violence, but the strain of unresolved structure. Systems built on clear exchanges were being asked to operate without a defined beginning. Time stretched. Seconds passed without anyone noticing their passage. Then, without signal or declaration, the conditions that made waiting possible disappeared. Those who tried to mark the exact moment later disagreed. Some said it began with a step. Others insisted it was a shift of weight, barely visible, that changed everything. What they agreed on was that there was no warning. The first movement was not aggressive. It was corrective. Bruce Lee did not strike in the way people expected striking to look. There was no chambering, no visible gathering of force. His body aligned briefly, as if obeying a simple instruction it had rehearsed countless times. Distance collapsed where it was inefficient and remained where it was not. One fighter found himself displaced. No stumble, no fall, simply no longer occupying the space he had prepared to defend. Another reacted instinctively, stepping in to compensate, only to discover that his timing had already been bypassed. The correction had happened before the reaction. What followed was not a sequence so much as a resolution. Lee's movements did not target individuals in isolation. They addressed relationships between bodies, between angles, between intentions. When one fighter adjusted, it affected another. When one line closed, another opened. Lee moved through these changes without pausing to acknowledge them. Witnesses later said it felt less like being attacked and more like being reorganized. There were brief contacts, hands meeting arms, shoulders brushing past hips, but nothing lingered long enough to be labeled a technique. Each interaction ended the moment it achieved its purpose. No follow-through, no insistence. One fighter attempted to assert control by committing fully, stepping forward with authority earned over years of dominance. Lee met him not with resistance, but with absence. The force traveled where Lee had been, and the man continued forward, off balance, redirected by his own intent. Another tried to recover by widening his stance, grounding himself. Lee adjusted his own alignment and passed through the gap that widened created, leaving the stance intact but irrelevant. The entire exchange unfolded in a compressed span of time. 12 seconds by later estimates. Long enough for movement to be undeniable. Too short for explanation to form. When it ended, no one was on the ground. Yet none of the 5 fighters stood as they had before. Their spacing had changed. Their posture had changed. Most importantly, their attention had shifted inward, no longer scanning the room, no longer measuring Lee, but recalibrating themselves. Bruce Lee stopped moving because there was nothing left to adjust. He did not assume a finishing posture. He did not look around to assess the effect. He simply returned to stillness, as if the interruption had concluded and ordinary time could resume. The silence that followed was not confusion. It was recognition, quiet, collective, and irreversible. No one spoke immediately, not because words were forbidden, but because language had fallen behind what had just occurred. The 5 fighters remained alert, yet their alertness had changed character. Where there had been outward focus, measuring distance, reading intent, there was now inward assessment. Each man stood where he was, not frozen, but momentarily unanchored from his previous certainty. This was not humiliation. There had been no decisive blow to point at, no loss dramatic enough to defend against with excuses. Nothing had been taken from them publicly. Something quieter had been removed. Assumption. One fighter subtly adjusted his stance, then stopped himself halfway through the correction. The movement no longer felt reliable. Another exhaled more slowly than before, as if noticing his breath for the first time since entering the room. These were small gestures, but to trained observers they signaled a deeper interruption. What had collapsed was not confidence but framework. Their systems were built to respond to recognizable threats. Force meeting force, speed answered by timing, pressure relieved through structure. What they had encountered instead was efficiency without declaration. Action without attachment. A response that did not escalate because it had no need to. Bruce Lee did not capitalize on the moment. He did not press advantage. He did not reset the exchange. He did not invite continuation or declare completion. His stillness now carried a different weight. Not anticipation, but closure. That restraint unsettled the fighters more than any continuation would have. In challenge culture, dominance is usually asserted through repetition. You prove something works by doing it again. Lee did not repeat himself. The demonstration was singular, not because it could not be extended, but because extension would have been redundant. One of the fighters later described the feeling as being corrected by a mirror rather than defeated by an opponent. The room absorbed this shift slowly. Those watching began to understand that what they had witnessed would not translate cleanly into stories. There were no clear techniques to name, no dramatic moments to reenact. Anyone who asked, "What did he do?" would receive answers that contradicted one another, all of them incomplete. And that, too, was part of the impact. The fighters did not leave immediately. Neither did Lee. They occupied the same space for a few moments longer, now sharing a quiet awareness that something fundamental had been exposed. Not a weakness, but a limitation. Eventually, one of the fighters stepped back from the ring. Not in retreat, but in acknowledgement. The others followed, each at his own pace, each carrying a private recalibration that would not be spoken aloud. Bruce Lee exited without comment. The lesson did not announce itself. It embedded itself. And in the years that followed, it would surface in places far removed from that room. Whenever efficiency replaced effort, whenever restraint outlasted force, whenever a practitioner chose to remove what was unnecessary rather than add what was impressive. The encounter was never recorded. No photographs circulated. No official accounts were published. What remained were fragments. Remarks exchanged quietly after training sessions. References made in passing by men who rarely spoke loosely. Over time, the details thinned rather than expanded. Those who had been present learned not to describe the event directly. When asked, they would pause, then redirect the conversation. Not out of secrecy, but out of recognition that description would reduce it. The moment resisted precision. It functioned better as a point of orientation than as a story. Years later, one of the fighters would be asked by a student whether the stories were true. He did not confirm them. He corrected the question. He spoke instead about efficiency, about how unnecessary movement reveals more than intent, about how power, when properly aligned, does not announce itself. The student did not realize he was receiving a second-hand lesson from that room. Another fighter altered his teaching quietly. His forms became shorter, his corrections fewer. He stopped emphasizing domination and began emphasizing positioning, where one stands and why. When questioned about the change, he cited experience, nothing more. Bruce Lee himself never referenced the encounter publicly. This omission mattered. In a culture where validation often requires repetition and explanation, His silence preserved the lesson in its original form. Unadorned, unresolved, intact. The absence of commentary prevented the moment from becoming doctrine. It remained adaptable. As martial arts continued to evolve, as disciplines crossed and blended more openly, the story surfaced again and again, not as a benchmark of victory, but as a warning against rigidity. Don't add unless you must. Don't commit before you see. Don't mistake structure for understanding. These phrases appeared in different schools, spoken by different instructors, often without attribution. They carried no signature, but they carried weight. The ring itself did not survive. The building changed hands. The floor was replaced. Whatever marks had been left by that brief exchange were erased by time and renovation. Yet the balanced disturbance endured. Not in bodies, but in thinking. The legend did not grow louder with repetition. It grew quieter, more compressed, until it became less about Bruce Lee and more about a principle. That true mastery leaves nothing extra behind. Not force, not explanation, not ego. Those who understood this did not speak of 12 seconds. They spoke of the moment they realized that winning was never the point. Only clarity was. And clarity, once encountered, does not need to be defended.